In this video, we're going to take a look at section 4.8, which is on solving equations by factoring. To solve a polynomial equation by factoring, you get 0 on one side of the equation first. So the equation has to be equal to 0 for this method to work. The second step is to factor the other side of the equation. So you'll have 0 on one side of the equation, you factor the other side of the equation. Once you have it factored, you set each factor equal to 0. And then in each individual case where you've done that, you'll solve for x. And at that point, you should be able to solve it without too much trouble. You just get x by itself on one side of the equation that you get in step 3, right? So the principle that allows this method to work is this. If you have it equal to 0, that's step 1, it's equal to 0. And then step 2 is you have it factored, which means you'll have 2 or more things being multiplied together. But let's just look at the case where there's 2 things multiplied together, and we'll just call those A and B. So you're going to have 2 things multiplied together equal to 0. And there's this principle of numbers that you know, that if 2 things are multiplied together and the answer is 0, what do you know about one of these 2 numbers? Well, one of these 2 numbers would have to equal 0, because the only way you can multiply and get an answer of 0 is for one of the 2 numbers to be 0. So either A has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0. And that's what step 3 is. It's taking each factor and setting it equal to 0, because the only way the equation can be true is for one of the factors to have to equal 0, right? But this is a property that only works with the number 0, right? So 2 things multiplied together equaling 0 can only happen if one of the 2 things that are being multiplied is equal to 0, right? And then what we're going to do is find out in each case what value of x would make that factor equal 0, and that's what step 4 is about. So let's apply this principle to an example so you can maybe better see what I'm talking about. All right, so t squared plus 5t equals 24. So we want to solve this equation. Note, first of all, that you can't just solve it by getting t by itself, because you have t in 2 different places here, and they're not like terms. So there's no way you can add, subtract, multiply, or divide to make one t out of these 2 t's, right? You're stuck with t squared and t, and no amount of moving things from one side to the other is going to change that. That's why we have to have this alternate way of solving this equation, by factoring. So the first step is to get 0 on one side. So I'm going to subtract the 24 back to the other side of the equation. So we'll get t squared plus 5t minus 24 equals 0. Right? So that's the first step, get it equal to 0. The second step is to factor this, and this one's an easier one to factor. They get a little bit harder later in the video. We need 2 numbers that multiply to negative 24 and add to 5. So 2 numbers that multiply to negative 24 but add to positive 5. It'll be positive 8 and negative 3. And because a is equal to 1 here, we can use this shortcut. Once we find those 2 numbers, we put those 2 numbers in our 2 factors and we have it factored. Right? So we have 2 things being multiplied together here. We have t plus 8 times t minus 3, and we know the answer is supposed to equal 0. Well, the only way to get 2 things multiplied together to equal 0 is for either the first thing to equal 0, so either the t plus 8 would have to equal 0, or the second thing would have to equal 0, the t minus 3. So this is step 3. We're going to take each factor and set it equal to 0, because these are the only 2 ways that equation can be true. Either the first factor is going to have to equal 0, or the second factor is going to have to equal 0. When does the first factor equal 0? For what value of t? We're about to find out. We'll solve this equation, and this is what step 4 is about. Solve this equation for t. We'll do that by subtracting 8 from both sides, and we get t is equal to negative 8. So when t is equal to negative 8, the first factor here will equal 0. Negative 8 plus 8 will give me 0. 0 times whatever I get from this factor doesn't matter. It's going to equal 0, right? Because 0 times anything will equal 0. What about the second factor? When does that one equal 0? Well, let's solve this for t. We'll add 3 to both sides, and we'll get t is equal to 3. So when t is equal to 3, that makes the second factor equal 0, right? 3 minus 3 gives me 0 here. So 0 times whatever I get from the first factor will equal 0. So it doesn't even matter what I get here. You get 11, right? If you plug in 3 for t, you get 3 plus 8, which will be 11. But 11 times 0 is still going to be 0. And so this will be another solution, right? By having the second factor equal to 0. So these are two different ways of getting this product to equal 0. So we have two solutions. And so this is what you would type into Math Excel as your answer. Both of them. You'll type them. So Math Excel is going to have a box like this, and you'll type in -8, 3. Just type in both numbers in the same box. All right, let's take a look at another example. All right, this one, step 1, is already done for me. It's already equal to 0. So I can just jump right to step 2, which is to factor the other side of the equation. This is the a squared minus b squared situation. We saw a lot of that in the last video in section 4.7. And we're seeing it again here. And you're going to see a lot in the next chapter of chapter 5. So you really want to make sure you got the a squared minus b squared formula figured out. So this will factor as a plus 1 times a minus 1. Right, so I'm going to rewrite 1 as 1 squared. Right, so instead of a, I have a. Instead of b, I have 1. And that's how I get my answer. A, not my answer, but that's how I get it factored. A plus 1, a minus 1. That's step 2. Step 3 is to set each factor equal to 0. So I'll get a plus 1 equals 0, a minus 1 equals 0. And then step 4, solve each of these for a. In the first case, I subtract 1 from both sides. I get a is equal to -1. In the second case, I add 1 to both sides. I get a is equal to +1. So again, we get two solutions. All right, so look at the next example. So this one's going to be more challenging on the factoring end of things, right? Step 1, already done for me. It's already equal to 0. Step 2, we got to factor this. So this one, I can't use a shortcut because a is not equal to 1. A is 14, c is 18. So I'm going to have to do the AC method here, or trial and error if you want to give that a try. It's going to be 14 times 18, which is going to be a pretty gigantic number. Let me see if I can find a calculator. Here's one right here. Okay, so I'm going to use a calculator to help me with that. And so we'll have 14 times 18, which is 252. All right, and then step 2 is to find two numbers that multiply to 252, but add to -33. So normally I'll spend a moment to try to see if I can think of it off the top of my head. So two numbers that multiply to 252. It's hard for me to think of any at all, except for the one I know here, which is 14 times 18, which I wouldn't even known that one if I didn't already have it on the screen. So I'm probably not going to think of this off the top of my head. So I'm going to have to dig a little deeper here. And so I talked about this method in 4.5, splitting up these numbers in a different way to see if maybe that would help us find two numbers that would add to 33. So I can think of 14 as 7 times 2. That's really the only way I can think of 14. 7 times 2. And I can think of 18 as 6 and 3. Could also be 9 and 2. So we might go back and look at that other option later if this doesn't work out. So let's regroup these. And I'm looking at, if I did 7 and 6, that'd be 42. That's going to be too big to add up to 33. So let's do 7 and 3. Let's put the 7 and the 3 together. So 7 and 3, which is going to give me 21. And then the 2 and the 6 together. The 2 and the 6 gives me 12. And what do you know? That actually does add up to 33. So that's actually what we're going to be looking for. So -21 and -12 multiply to give me 252, but will add together to give me -33. All right, so let's go ahead and use those two numbers to factor this. We'll have 14w squared minus 21w minus 12w plus 18. I'll leave the equals 0 out of it for the moment until we get this factored. All right, and so we'll group the first two terms together. We have 14w squared minus 21w. Always start with a plus sign between your two groups. We'll have -12 plus 18 in our second group. Common factor in the first group is going to be 7w. It's going to leave me with 2w minus 3. Common factor in the second group would be a 6, but I want to change the sign of these two terms to match the sign of my first group's parentheses. And so I will factor out a negative with the 6. So we'll get 2w minus 3 in the second group, common factor of 2w minus 3. So we can factor that out. And that's going to leave me with 7w minus 6. Now don't forget, we're trying to solve an equation. I will see this happen on the test. Students will get to work on factoring this, and they get so absorbed in that they lose sight of the overall problem. So they get it factored, and then they quit. They move on to the next problem. And they forgot that really what they want here is not factor, but solve, right? You don't want to just have two factors. You want to have your solutions to the equation. What is w equal to, right? So don't forget, this is still equal to 0, right? And we're still trying to find the solution to this equation. So let's move on to step 3, which is to set each factor equal to 0. So we'll have 2w minus 3 equals 0, and we'll have 7w minus 6 equals 0. And then step 4 is solve each of these for w. So we'll add 3 to both sides for this one. And we get 2w is equal to 3. And then we solve for w by dividing 2 on both sides. So we'll get w is equal to 3 halves. So that's one of my solutions. This time it's a fraction. Do the same thing here. We'll add 6 to both sides. We get 7w is equal to 6. Divide by 7 on both sides. We get w is equal to 6 over 7. All right. And so those would be my two solutions to this equation. Okay, so let's take a look at another example. So here we have 9w to the third power equals 225w. First step is not done for me here. I have to do this. I have to get 0 on one side. So we'll subtract the 225w to the other side. So we'll get 9w to the third power minus 225w equals 0. Now we did this problem the other day in my class, my face-to-face class, and I made a pretty embarrassing mistake. I said, okay, we'll factor out a w, right? Because whenever you're factoring, which is our next step, right? Step 2 is, let's get this factored. I thought the first thing you want to do is factor out the common factor, which is correct, but I thought only w could be factored out here. And I had one of my students in class tell me, well, you can also factor out the 9. And so it's kind of embarrassing for me that I didn't catch that myself. So you can actually factor out 9w here. Right? So factor out the 9w. What we're going to be left with here, if we factor out the 9 and a w, is w squared. And if we take a 9 away from this, 9 goes into 18 2 times. And then we'll have 4 left over, so 45. 9 goes into 45 5 times. All right, so we'll get 25. Or just use a calculator. I have one here. I should have just done that. 225 divided by 9 gives you 25. And then we took away the w, right? But remember, with factoring, we learned this in the last section, 4.7. You don't just do one layer of factoring and quit. You check to see if there's anything else that could be factored any further. And in this problem, there is, right? So we factor out the 9w. That leaves me with w squared minus 25, which can then be factored again, right? Using the a squared minus b squared formula. This will factor as w plus 5 times w minus 5. And then a 9w is going to copy down. So again, this is the a squared minus b squared formula. And 25 can be written as 5 to the second power, right? So instead of a, we have w. Instead of b, we have 5. So this will factor as a plus b times a minus b. Instead of a, we have w. Instead of b, we have 5. So this is a plus b right here, w plus 5. This is a minus b right here, w minus 5. All right, third step. Let's continue up here. We'll set each of these factors equal to 0. So we'll have 9w equals 0. We'll have w plus 5 equals 0. And then we're going to have w minus 5 equals 0. So this time we have 3 factors. And the rule is you set each factor equal to 0. So take each of the factors and set them equal to 0. And you get an answer from each one of them as long as there's a variable there. Now, if the w wasn't here, if all we did was factor out the 9 and there was no w, 9 by itself does not give us a solution because there's no variable with it. But 9w will give us a solution. So solve that for w. We divide by 9 on both sides. We get w is equal to 0. Right. So 0 divided by 9 is still 0. Here we subtract 5 from both sides. We get w is equal to negative 5. Here we add 5 to both sides. And we get w is equal to positive 5. So this time we have 3 solutions to the equation. Notice that the highest power of w here is 3, and we get 3 answers. So that's not a complete coincidence. That's the rule of thumb. So whatever the highest power of the variable is, that's how many solutions you should tend to expect. There are some issues with having repeated answers where you get the same answer twice that you have to be careful about. But in general, whatever the highest power is, that's how many answers you end up getting. All right, and so that was step 4, by the way, solving it for w. Okay. Let's take a look at this one. This one's also not a very friendly looking one for factoring. The first thing I would do here is to not factor out the common factor. You should try to factor out the common factor. Sorry, my mind kind of trailed there a bit. Is to put this in order from highest to lowest power. So let's write this as negative 10w squared minus 41w plus 18. All right, from highest to lowest power before we try to start factoring it. Then you should look for a common factor, which there is none in this case. The 41 kind of ruins that, right? 41's a prime number. It's going to be hard to factor anything out of that. So, but what I would recommend doing is I find it's difficult to factor when a is a negative value. I don't like a being negative. Whether I'm doing the shortcut method or the AC, you can't really do the shortcut method when a is negative anyways, actually. But if I'm trying to do the AC method and I have a negative value for a, things just behave in a different enough way that it gives me some trouble. So even though there's no common factor, I'm going to factor out a negative sign. So this will become positive 10w squared plus 41w minus 18. And then with a being positive, I think things just work out better that way. It goes more smoothly. And again, it's just kind of a personal preference for me. You don't have to do that. You can leave the a negative, and if you're okay with that and it doesn't cause you any problems, that's perfectly fine. All right, so let's go ahead and factor. We're going to have to do the AC method. So a times c is going to be 10 times 18, which will be 180. b is equal to 41. So we need two numbers that multiply to 180, add to 41. So another method you might use, if you can't think of what these two numbers are off the top of your head, instead of doing the split thing here, which you could try, it's a little tricky this time, but you can make it work. Another thing you could do is this. Let's just list all the numbers that multiply to 180. We have 1 times 180. Obviously, that doesn't add or subtract. I kind of messed up here, didn't I? This should be a negative 18, so this should be negative 180. So because we want two numbers that multiply to a negative, I need a positive and a negative number, which means when I add them together, they actually subtract each other. So I'm really looking for two numbers that subtract to give me 41. Either way, 1 and 180 isn't going to work. 2 times 90, well, that doesn't give me 41 in any way. 3 and 60 does not give me 41. But 4 and 45 does, right? 4 times 45 is going to be 180. And then if I make one of these negative, like if I make the 4 negative, when I add those together, negative 4 plus 45 will add to 41. So there's my two numbers, negative 4 and positive 45. And there's more numbers that multiply to 180, but as soon as you find what you're looking for, you just stop at that point. All right, so we're going to take those two numbers and rewrite the middle term with those two numbers. So I'm going to rewrite 41w as negative 4w plus 45w. I'll still have the 10w squared. I'll still have the minus 18. Now we're going to do factor by grouping. Right, and so we're going to group the first two terms together, w squared minus 4w. Always start with a plus sign between your two groups, and then we'll group the second two terms together. I'm going to leave the equals 0 out. I'm going to leave the negative sign out. Let's just get it factored, and then we'll bring all that stuff back in. So factor out the common factor here. That's going to be 2w. We'll have 5w minus 2 left over when I factor that out. Plus, we'll factor out a 9 here, and that's going to leave me with 5w minus 2. So I have the same factor in both of these groups, so I can factor that out. So I'll factor out the 5w minus 2. It'll leave me with 2w plus 9. Now I'm done factoring, so we'll bring the negative sign back. We'll bring the equals 0 back. And I need a little bit more room to finish out this problem. Hopefully that's enough room there. All right, so let me enumerate the steps because I really didn't start off doing that at the beginning. Step 1 was already done for me. It was already equal to 0. So we jumped right into step 2, which is to factor. And that's all we've done so far is step 2. Now that we have it factored, we're ready to move on to step 3, which is set each factor equal to 0. Now technically the negative sign is a factor, but it doesn't have a variable. So it doesn't produce any solutions, so we can just ignore it. Now if all you're trying to do is factor it, then that's an important part of the answer, right? The negative sign needs to be in your answer when you're typing in the Math Excel. But if you're trying to solve this equation, the negative sign produces nothing. It contributes nothing. So we'll have 5w minus 2 equals 0, and we'll have 2w plus 9 equals 0, right? So we set each of these factors equal to 0. Each of these factors that has a variable equal to 0. All right, the negative sign, again, like I said, it's an important part of the factoring, but it's not contributing anything to solutions to this equation. Okay, so now we'll solve this for w. We'll add 2 to both sides, and this thing, I've already done too much writing on this screen, so it's giving me a hard time now, so I apologize for that. Add 2 to both sides. I'll just try to slow it down a little bit. We get 5w equals 2, then we divide by 5 on both sides, and we get w is equal to 2/5. All right, so again, this is step 4, solve for w. Okay, so that's one solution. The other solution, we'll subtract 9 from both sides. We'll get 2w, oops, went too fast there. 2w equals -9. And then we divide by 2 on both sides, and we get w equals -9/2. Let's try that one more time. Okay. Okay. And so those are my 2 solutions, which is how many you should expect, because the highest power was 2, so we should be getting 2 answers to this equation. All right, let's see if I have any more examples for you guys. All right, so this is a problem you'll see on the homework. This will not be on my exam if you're taking my class, but just to kind of give you another application for what we're learning to do here. And we're going to have more applications of this in the next chapter, chapter 5 as well. Applications for factoring and solving equations. So here we want to find the domain. And we talked about domain back in chapter 2. The domain is the set of all values that x is allowed to equal. When you have a function like this, what x is not allowed to equal is anything that makes your denominator equal 0. Right? So the denominator cannot equal 0. That's our limitation here. That's our restriction. In the past, we did these problems back in chapter 2. I don't know if you remember, but they were a little bit simpler. So they might have been something like this. 2 over x minus 5. Where you could kind of look at it and see what was off limits. Right? So what am I not allowed to plug in for x here? Well, I don't want this to equal 0, so I can't plug in 5. Right? I can't plug in 5 for x because 5 minus 5 would give me 0, and then I'm dividing by 0. So you could just look at it. So in math, we call this by inspection. By inspection, you can tell that x is not allowed to equal 5. And so your domain would be all real numbers except for 5. You're not going to be able to tell by just inspection here. You can't just tell by inspection x can't equal this or this. You're going to have to actually work for it and find out what is x not allowed to equal. So here's the way I like to set it up. I like to first write, here's what's not allowed. So what's not allowed to happen is the denominator, let's pick a different color here, the denominator is not allowed to equal 0. Right? So x squared minus x minus 6 is not allowed to equal 0. Right? This is the thing that's not supposed to happen. Because if this is equal to 0, I get 3 divided by 0, and I'm dividing by 0, and that's a problem. Equations don't work when you're dividing by 0. All right, now what I want to do now that I've set this up, this is what's not allowed to happen. It's an equation that I can now solve for x to find out what x is not allowed to equal. So we'll solve this for x. We're going to have to do it by factoring. It's already equal to 0, so that step's already done. Step 2, factor the other side. Whoops, I don't know why I'm doing w. I guess because we saw that a bunch earlier in the video. This is x. We want to find 2 numbers that multiply to -6 and add to -1. So it's going to be x minus 3 and x plus 2. Right? So 2 numbers that multiply to -6 and add to -1 are going to be -3 and positive 2. And then we set each factor equal to 0. Right? That's the next step. We'll get x minus 3 equals 0, x plus 2 equals 0, And then the last step is solve for x. So we'll get x is equal to 3 in this case, and x is equal to -2 in this case. But remember, all of this is what's not allowed to happen. X squared minus 6, sorry, I'm saying the wrong thing. X squared minus x minus 6 is not allowed to equal 0, which means that x is not allowed to equal 3, and x is not allowed to equal -2. So these are the two things x is not allowed to equal. So the domain here is going to be all real numbers, and x cannot equal 3 or -2. And I assume Math Excel will either have a box for you to type that in, or it'll be one of your multiple choice options. So you should see that somewhere listed on your multiple choice options. All right. Okay, so finding the domain. So essentially you take the denominator, you set it equal to 0, and you solve for x, and that tells you what x is not allowed to equal. So the domain would be everything but those numbers. So that's summarizing what we've just done. All right. Let's take a look at this last page. So just like I've done on several of the videos for Chapter 4, I've put a set of problems on one page for you to try out. So it might take a while, but I think it's worth it. So if you'll pause the video, try to solve each of these equations. So that means get it equal to 0, factor it, set each factor equal to 0, and then solve for the variable. So your final answer should be s equals blank or c equals blank. And you should have two solutions for each of these equations, right? Because notice the highest power on each of them is 2. So all of these should have 2 answers. So go ahead and pause it, see what you can do with that, and then resume the video, and you can check your answers to see if you were doing them correctly. All right, so here are the solutions to these 4 problems. So I tried to provide a little bit of detail so you can see how the answers are arrived at. So for the first problem over here, right here, the first thing I would do is write this from highest to lowest power. It's already equal to 0, so that's good, but for the factoring part of it, we want it from highest to lowest power, so I did that up here. And then as I mentioned earlier, I don't like it when a is negative. So I'm going to factor out a negative sign to make that a positive value. And not only does that make it easier for factoring having a be positive, but having a 1 there means we can use the shortcut. So if I leave it as a -1, you can't use the shortcut. You factor the negative out of there, you can use the shortcut. And so we'll factor this by asking for 2 numbers that multiply to -32 and add to -4. Sorry, I feel like I'm not talking very well all of a sudden, but we're going to try our best because we're right at the end of the video. So 2 numbers that multiply to -32, add to -4 would be -8 and +4. So we can just jump right to the answer because a is equal to 1. So it'll factor as s minus 8, s plus 4. You set each factor equal to 0, solve for s in each case. You should get 8 and -4. For this problem over here, first step is we have to get it equal to 0. So we subtract the 2c over to the other side. This one only has 2 terms, but this one we won't have to factor using a squared minus b squared. All we're going to have to do is factor out the common factor. All right, so the common factor here is going to be 2c. I factor that out. That leaves me with 7c minus 1. Set each factor equal to 0. Right, so 2c equal to 0, 7c minus 1 equal to 0. And then solve for c. So divide by 2 here, you get c is equal to 0. Here you're going to add 1 to the other side, and then divide by 7. And that's how you get that answer. Let's do this one real quick, and then we'll save the best for last there. This one's already equal to 0, so you just jump right into factoring. So I started by factoring out the common factor, which is 8. And then that leaves me with c squared minus 1, which fits the a squared minus b squared formula. So I'm going to factor it using that formula. It factors as c plus 1, c minus 1. And then you set each factor equal to 0, but not the 8. Right? You don't set the 8 equal to 0 because it doesn't have a variable. So again, for the factoring part of it, it's an important part of the answer. Right? If this wasn't an equation, if this was just 8c squared minus 8, and it told us just to factor it, then you can't ignore the 8. That's an important part of the answer. But for solving this equation, since there's no variable there, it produces no solution. So it doesn't do anything really. So we can kind of just ignore it. And so we just set the factors that have a variable equal to 0. And I kind of skipped a little bit of detail here, but when you set this equal to 0 and solve for c, you should get -1. When you set this one equal to 0 and solve for c, you should get positive 1. So you get negative 1 and positive 1 there. This one, we have to first start by getting the equation equal to 0, which is what I did up here. Subtract the 20 to the other side. And then we're going to try to factor this. And this one's going to be tough factoring because a is not equal to 1. There's no shortcut here. We're just going to have to do the AC method. A times c is going to be 30 times 20, 30 times negative 20, which will be negative 600. And b is equal to 1. And so it took me a little bit of searching, so I didn't just get this off the top of my head, but I'm going to leave it to you to figure out how to get this result. The two numbers you're looking for are positive 25 and negative 24. That multiplies to negative 600, and it adds to positive 1. So I rewrite the middle term here using those two numbers, and then I do factor by grouping, right? Group the first two terms, group the second two terms, factor out the common factor from each group, and I get 5c times 6c plus 5. Factor out negative 4 here, I get negative 4 times 6c plus 5. Because those factors are the same, I can factor them out. I can factor it out. I factor out the 6c plus 5. It leaves me with 5c minus 4 as my second factor. And now that I have it factored, I set each factor equal to 0 and I solve. And I'm running out of room here. And plus all the writing I'm doing, it was getting really laggy, so I had trouble writing more than this. So I left out some details. I apologize for that. But you'll set each of these equal to 0 and solve for c. And when you do that, you should find these two solutions. c equals negative 5/6. That's from this factor. And c equals 4/5. That's from this factor. All right. So that concludes the video on section 4.8 on solving equations by factoring.